My name is Dacia Clay. I'm the audio librarian here at Classical 91.7. While I'm a real librarian, I have a deep, dark secret. I know very little about classical music. I grew up listening to rock, and I know something about jazz. But when it comes to classical, I really want to learn. So, every week on this show, a classical music expert will give me a piece of classical music they think I should know, and then we'll discuss it. Come learn with me in the classical classroom. Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Classical Classroom. I'm Dacia Clay, and here with me today is internationally acclaimed pianist Clive Swansbourne. He received his doctorate at the Yale School of Music. He's toured through pretty much every state in the U.S., playing recitals. And he's a music teacher who's taught master classes at universities and colleges throughout the U.S. In recent years, he performed the complete cycle of Beethoven's 32 piano sonatas, as well as a cycle of Schubert's late piano works, both at the Rothko Chapel in Houston, one of my favorite places. So many other things I could say, but Clive, welcome to the show. So glad to have you.
Thank you very much.
So what are we going to be talking about today?
Well, I brought one of my favorite pieces of all piano music, which is the third Impromptu by Franz Schubert, who happens to be probably my favorite composer of all, although I wouldn't want to have a gun to my head, but I would probably end up saying, yeah, give me Schubert. Let me take him to a desert island. But this is one of his great shorter works. It's 6 minutes, so for Schubert it's fairly short, actually, because he tended to write longer pieces. And I think it's one of a very interesting case of a piece which is in sort of perpetual motion with a melody on the top, very simple tools that he uses, melody on top and accompaniment underneath, rippling accompaniment. And most composers that were doing this at the time wrote very pretty pieces doing it, but Schubert manages to take it to new depths, and I'll be explaining just how he does that. He really makes a lot of mileage out of these simple techniques.
Tell me a little bit about Schubert. Like, when did he live? Where did he live? Who were his classical music contemporaries?
He was roughly contemporary with Beethoven. He was a few years younger than Beethoven. He was born in the very end of the 18th century and died 31 years later in 1828. And very young, obviously. But in that 31 years, he just composed an amazing amount of music. And he also achieved much more in terms of musical maturity than just about any composer. When we look at what he was composing at 17, for example, no composer really can rival what Schubert was doing at the age of 17. And then certainly at the age of 31, absolutely no composer ever has rivaled what he did at the age of 31. I mean, Mozart lived another 4 years, and he could catch up. He obviously did rival what Schubert did in the in his last year. But I can't think of any composer that came close to Schubert in his last maybe couple of years in terms of sheer maturity. And it just makes you think, what on earth would he have done if he'd lived another 20 years? But we don't like to think about that kind of thing.
I think it's so fascinating that people from centuries ago seem to accomplish so much by such a young age. So many times when you hear about, a musical genius like Schubert or a writer or, an artist, they've reached this height of success by the time that we're graduating high school in the U.S. or learning to drive a car.
Yeah, exactly. Well, there are prodigies now who, are overachievers as well. And I guess time will tell whether they make the same kind of claims on our attention that Schubert does. But in those days, there were very few distractions. So if you really did have a drive to do something, you didn't have distractions to stop you doing that. So that helped, I think. Hear
that, kids? Get off the internet. So this piece is called an Impromptu. What exactly does that mean?
Well, it means improvised, but these pieces obviously weren't improvised. The reason the word impromptu was used because in the early Romantic period, these single movement pieces, which have a sort of one main character going through them, was very popular, and they were usually lyrical pieces with titles evoking some sort of different mood in the composer. And Schubert was one of the early progenitors of this kind of music, and he latched onto the word impromptu Well, actually, his publisher did. He just wrote the music, and his publisher told him, well, look, we have this chap, Voříšek, who's composing these impromptus and making lots of money, so let's call them impromptus. And Schubert said, okay, money, I like money, I'm not going to get in the way of that. So they were named for him, impromptus. But really, they're not improvised. It's like preludes. A lot of preludes which were written at the end of the 19th century, they weren't intended to be played before anything. They didn't prelude anything. They're just called preludes because that was a handy title for a short piece. And so don't look for any kind of character of improvisation. These are highly structured pieces.
Mm-hmm. So what is it that you kind of mentioned that Schubert really took this kind of music, this impromptu form, and he sort of moved it forward. He gave it a greater depth. He changed it.
Yeah.
But what makes this particular impromptu that we're going to talk about special? Like, why did you choose this one?
Well, partly because it stays the same all the way through. He doesn't have a middle section where he suddenly changes everything from running notes to chords, and slower music. Where most of the other impromptus have middle sections to them. You can see more of a structure. This is more free-flowing structure rather than sort of ABA that you expect from the classical period. And so that's one of the reasons. Another reason is it's very difficult to carry a melody, a long melody, without really changing the structure and make a piece work for 6 minutes. That's a long time for a piece to work. Of course, there is contrast in mood, as I shall show, but I mean, in rhythm and in basic layout, you look at each page, the pages look the same. There's not much visual contrast there.
Well, I would love to hear some of it.
Yeah. Well, would you like me to play just the first few measures of it for now?
Sure, and we can talk about it.
It's a meltingly beautiful tune. There's no question about it. And it's got this very lyrical underneath part, which, I mean, in the middle, it's a flowing, rippling accompaniment. That's the first, minute or so of that piece.
Yeah.
And we could already hear, the first couple of phrases were quite placid and tranquil.
Yeah.
And then already he's sort of getting out of that tranquility. And the next one. And then to put peace, to get more peace into the music, he then does this phrase to bring the temperature down a little bit. And he does this all the way through the piece too. Each time he has this sort of peaceful section, it's not long before he then moves to a more turbulent section.
Yeah.
And soon he moves into the minor key here, into E flat. This piece is in G flat major, which is practically all played on the black keys of the piano, actually, which is interesting because almost no pieces are written. Do you play the piano? Six flats.
I used to.
6 flats. In fact, when I first learned this piece, I learned it from a very bad edition, or at least of that piece it was a very bad edition. They'd transferred it to G major, which is all white keys. There was only one sharp, so they were hoping that wouldn't be so fearsome, But actually it's much easier to play in G flat major, and obviously Schubert knew that. It's much more simpatico, you're on the black keys, and it's much easier to float across the music. He moves to E flat minor, which is much more turbulent. We'll go for the end of this little passage. And then we move to E flat minor. See, he does it again there with that beautiful phrase, all this turbulence. These sort of dissonances. And then this, I think of it as pouring balm on the wounds, you know, like he's had a... I don't like to say that he got into any kind of mood or out of any kind of mood when he was writing music. I think composers work on a different level from that. They don't go into a studio thinking, oh, I feel dreadful today. I think I'm going to write a really sad piece. That's not the way it works. I mean, you know, maybe Mozart, when he wrote his most sad and tragic pieces, was just bubbling with joy. And he was just bubbling with joy with being able to do it, you know. We don't know. We can't possibly imagine what was going on in the minds or in the emotions of composers when they were writing. But he manages to conjure in this music kind of an emotional turbulence. It's peaceful one moment, and then it's very turbulent the next, and then it's peaceful. And obviously he knew as a composer, and he wrote this actually in the last months of his life, when he knew he was dying, and his one worry was getting out as much music as he was teeming in his brain. You know, he just wanted to get it out. So well, that was his only concern, to write the greatest possible music he could. And I don't think he spent a lot of time feeling sorry for himself, to be honest.
Well, what I noticed when I was listening to the piece, when I was doing my homework, is that like it sort of starts out of the gate, and the two hands are kind of in agreement. Everything seems to be sort of moving along nicely.
Yeah.
And then there begins, when the part that you just played, there's like this split, and there's a
sort of duet.
There's a sort of darkness begins to enter.
Yes.
Yeah. And that kind of builds. But what's funny is that, like you said, it keeps coming back to that one refrain that kind of calms things down. It's like it's like there's this anxiety, and then this other inner voice going, no, it's cool.
Exactly.
Like,
it's the inner voice saying, calm down, Schubert. It's going to be all right.
Don't freak out.
Yeah, it's exactly like that. And it's like, I like to think of it as an angel pouring balm on his emotional wounds, you know.
Yeah.
And he does it twice in this piece. And I'll play you the bit just before he does it the second time. It's a very calm part of the piece. It goes where I just left off, actually. It goes down into the depths of the piano, and we have these dark notes which he had introduced there. He sort of develops that idea, and it becomes very mysterious down here. He loved these deep notes. Then we have that wonderful phrase again. And I think all this mysterious stuff down here was unique to Schubert. Unique to Schubert's late music.
Yeah.
He loved to use these very low, mysterious notes to
it gives
color
it like
his
such
music.
flavor.
Yeah.
Such like color.
And we have all that. And then we have the absolute opposite, the sun coming out,
That like juxtaposition of that like sunny brightness and this dark sort of.
So we get the darkness, and then it kind of rises out of the darkness, and we think, oh, it's going to be heroic or joyful. No.
Just kidding.
Immediate problems again, drama. And here, we got this extra little thing on top. Even more angst there, you see.
I think what you kind of touched on earlier is something that's worth talking about a little bit. You were saying essentially that there is a lot of angst in this piece, but that angst may not have necessarily been autobiographical, and that's something that I think a lot of people might take for granted when listening to a piece of music. Like you assume, like I think about. What is it called? It's Tchaikovsky's the Suicide.
The Pathetique Symphony?
Yeah.
The last symphony?
Right.
Pathetique,
and people assume that like the drama in that is just, it's basically his suicide note,
Oh yeah, I know.
But,
people do think that.
But I think that the job of artists, if they can be said to have a job, is to explore the human psyche and like not. It's not necessarily, their work is not necessarily indicative of what they are personally experiencing at that time.
Exactly.
It's something
absolutely.
greater.
I think that has to be true. Otherwise, Schubert, was deathly ill when he was writing these pieces. He wrote his great song cycle, one of them, in hospital. Most people when they're in hospital being treated for a serious disease, which he was, they'd just be flopping to sleep whenever they possibly could.
Right.
Not even want to work at all. But he was up and working. It's obviously, when you're that driven like he was, and when you're that consumed by your work, you forget your troubles. And I think that was obviously the way that he was. He just was able to completely forget his troubles and not even feel ill necessarily when he was working. That's my theory.
Well, and that's because you're delving into something bigger than you, bigger than yourself. You're thinking about something grander.
And he knew it. He knew that he had work to do that was very important work, and that his time was limited. Tchaikovsky didn't. I think Tchaikovsky was on the absolute cusp of joy and happiness when he wrote that Pathetique Symphony.
I've read that, yeah.
He had composed an amazing masterpiece, and he knew it. He was at the top of his powers.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it had nothing to do with autobiography at all.
But still, that ability to sort of, like an actor, put on the sort of clothing, for lack of a better term, of somebody who is feeling that way.
Yes.
And to be able to
exactly. Well, he obviously had felt. He knew all about emotional things. He knew about them, and he knew how to put them into music. But he couldn't, I think, afford to indulge in them while he was working. I'm almost sure he couldn't afford to do that.
You were talking about the fact that there were people at the time who were making pieces like this, and they were just kind of making them to, pay the rent and to make money. And,
everyone was doing that. Schubert was doing that. Everyone was, but yeah.
But he did it in a special way.
Yeah, he certainly did.
With panache. And you were going to give an example of another composer.
Well, the composer who influenced Schubert most of all in his impromptus was a composer called Voříšek, who was one of the, we call minor composers. They wrote some very interesting music, but they're mostly important because of who they influenced and how they influenced them. And Voříšek was a Bohemian composer. I think he lived in Vienna, but in any case, he wrote miniatures, but I'll show that they're very pretty. This particular one is his fourth impromptu, and from the set that had done so well and caused Schubert's pieces to be called impromptus as well. And we'll see how it's a very pretty piece, but it doesn't nearly get to the the nitty-gritty like Schubert's does.
Yeah.
It's not beautiful in the same way. It's pretty rather than beautiful. Again, it's melody and accompaniment. I'll just play a section of it.
Okay. Yeah, it's not plumbing any depths.
No,
it's not dredging anything up.
That's
it's
right.
Not touching on a.
And he goes on in a craftsman-like way and to create, goes into different keys, but the melody remains pretty much the same uniform rhythm all the time. And even though he goes into keys in an effective way, and he was a professional, he knew what he was doing. But yeah, that's what's missing. That's what we notice as being the difference between Schubert and this kind of music, which doesn't plumb the depths.
Yeah.
Which doesn't explore the emotional ranges. I mean, in Schubert we saw it started off very lyrical, and the first 8 measures may have been written by Voříšek. We don't know. I mean, if Voříšek could have written that, but potentially he could, because nothing much happens in the first 8 measures of the Schubert. It's a beautiful melody, we know, but it's very sweet and lyrical. It's what happens after that which separates Schubert from composers such as Voříšek.
Yeah, you can really hear that he takes it somewhere deeper.
Somewhat deeper for this kind of single movement piece, yeah. Because obviously, Beethoven in his symphonies, or Mozart in his symphonies for that matter, had really plumbed the depths.
Yeah.
So Schubert was up against that. He knew Beethoven very well and was very influenced by Beethoven. And one of the things he had to make sure of, and he was very careful of, was not to be influenced by Beethoven too much. And he was able to actually to pay homage to Beethoven's music by quoting Beethoven ideas in his own music.
Really?
But he refused to meet Beethoven.
Really?
He was a pallbearer at Beethoven's funeral, which was a year before Schubert's own funeral, by the way. He was a pallbearer at that, and he was an admirer of Beethoven, but the closest he allowed himself to get to Beethoven was to go to a coffee shop on Saturday mornings, where Beethoven would go on Saturday mornings to leaf through the music, the new music that had been published, and usually scowl and walk out in a temper. But Schubert would never introduce himself. He wrote to Beethoven early in his life at 17 and sent his Erlkönig, the most famous song by Schubert, even though he only wrote it when he was 17. And Beethoven expressed interest in Schubert. He said, "This is a wonderful talent. This composer is going to go far." And most composers would have jumped to that and gone and knocked on Beethoven's door and, got to know him and become under his influence. Schubert was very careful not to do that, because he knew he had his own lights to develop.
Okay.
And he knew that Beethoven's personality was so immense and so strong that getting too close to it would sort of kind of water down his own personality, which was totally different.
Wow. So it's like Beethoven was like this black hole and he didn't want to get too close to it.
Yes.
So that he,
exactly.
He was influenced That's, wow. That's dedication.
It really is. And it was, Schubert knew that he had something to protect, I think. And he knew that Beethoven was a very strong, not just personality, musical personality, but personality as well. And he didn't want to come magnetized by it.
So Schubert was not only taking care of his work and its sort of sanctity, but of himself.
Yes, his independence on all levels.
Yeah.
Both personally and artistically, I think, yeah.
Good on Schubert.
Yeah, he knew his business.
This piece, is this something that music students learn? Is it something that's more challenging that people strive to play later in their careers? Is it well known?
Oh, very well. I think it's very well known. One of his best known pieces, really. It's hard to really bring off, because anything that has one sort of a melody line, all of which is played by the pinky, incidentally. This little thing has to carry all the weight of most of the melodies, except the ones in the bass, of course. but it's pinky all the way, and you have to play with a very adaptable pinky. You've got to shape the phrases all with the pinky, all with one finger. So it's hard to do, to get the lyricism of it and to get the emotional range. So it's a mature piece to do.
Yeah.
Kids do learn it, but they tend to not quite get it, you know.
Right.
And so it's probably better to learn when you're a little bit older. In fact, the range of interpretations of this piece is very wide. I tend to take it at a sort of flowing pace, but someone like Horowitz, for example, plays it extremely slowly. So it's, which doesn't suit me. It suited him because he had that kind of temperament. It was a sort of modern kind of view to take of it, where each note was a bell sound accompanied by, you know, immaterial flutterings, and, you know, that kind of physical control was the main attractive force for listening to that. And each bell sound was not necessarily connected to the next bell sound. It was just a beautiful series of bell sounds. And so it works on that level. And other people go, and I think I'm from this kind of school, go for more of a melodic sweep, which requires a faster tempo. If you're going to get the pinkies to do a legato phrase in a very shaped way, then it requires to be played a little quicker.
Well, I would love to hear your interpretation of the whole piece.
Okay.
You wanna play it before we sign off?
Okay, we can do that. Sure.
Cool. That was amazing. That was Schubert's Impromptu in G flat major, played by the inimitable Clive Swansbourne. That's a coy smile.
That's always a double-edged word.
Inimitable.
Like interesting is always a very interesting word to use.
That was great. Thank you so much. And I really appreciate you being on this show today.
Thank you. I enjoyed it thoroughly.
Everybody, that about does it for this episode of Classical Classroom. If you want to hear more of the show, go to houstonpublicmedia.org/classroom. You can also subscribe to us on iTunes. You can listen to us on our exhaustive SoundCloud page at soundcloud.com/classical classroom. And now, drumroll, you can also listen to us on Stitcher Radio. Make sure to like us or review us or whatever, wherever you listen. Thanks to our audio producer, Todd, drop it like it's Todd, Hulslander, for making us sound oh so nice. To our program director, St. John Flynn, for his keen oversight and strong jawline. To Clive Swansbourne for taking time out of his busy schedule to be on the show today. To me for saying words. And of course to you for listening. We'll catch you next time.